Greetings, all. Welcome to Aquarian Diary. I'm your host, John Irving. It is June 10th, 2023, although most of this was recorded on June 8th. This episode is a bit unusual. Like my previous episode, titled Awake or Abyss, it's a bit of a rant. I have previously expressed how I feel I'm kind of like a Cassandra. I can't even recall what episode it was now. It was quite a while ago. In mythology, Cassandra had the gift of foresight. She was a seer, and her curse was that even though her prophecies would come true, nobody would believe them or listen to her. So you can imagine how agonizing that would be. On June 7th, I published an episode titled Awake or Abyss, which I actually had worked on for 3 days. The bulk of it was recorded 2 days before I published it. And of course, while I was working on it, there's part of me that knows a lot of people just don't want to hear this, even though it's true. And I know that because I've been talking about the environmental crisis for decades. Last night, I was contemplating the moment when I realized how serious of a problem this was going to be. I believe it was around 2005. By then, I was quite well informed about the topic, and I had read about it for years. What happened was I was on a ferry between Vancouver, British Columbia, and Victoria. It's a beautiful area. And I was on deck because I wanted to see the islands and the sea. And I ended up chatting with someone who turned out to be a very interesting person. He was maybe 10 or 15 years older than me. He was very well read. He was very progressive, very intelligent, and we had a great conversation about politics, social issues, and so forth. Inevitably, the topic of global warming came up, and he just shrugged it off. And I was quite taken aback by this. So I asked him to explain, and he said, "Oh, we'll solve that." And I asked, "How are we going to do that?" And he said, "We'll develop some kind of technology that'll fix that. I'm not worried about it." I was quite stunned by this assertion. I asked, "What kind of technology?" He said, "Oh, I don't know. We always come up with solutions, eventually." I walked away from that and mentioned it to my girlfriend, who I was traveling with at the time. And that conversation stuck with me for a very long time, because I realized that if someone like him, who was so smart and well-informed, could believe that humanity had a very big problem on its hands. At that time, and even now, I am not aware of any technology that can remotely, not even remotely, address this problem in the form of a silver bullet. We do not have any kind of technology that is capable of modifying a planetary biosphere in any kind of meaningful capacity in any kind of reasonable time frame. Not even close. It's a fantasy. There's a couple things like solar radiation management, which could be very dangerous and make things much worse. Nuclear winter would do it, but clearly that has significant downsides. But aside from that, the geological processes that naturally sequester carbon could take thousands, if not tens of thousands of years. So that incident, the discussion on the ferry, and becoming aware of how even seemingly rational people can be subject to things like wishful thinking and self-delusion, changed the course of my life. We needed to address this global emergency right then, and not 40 years from now when some magical technology is going to appear, or not. I then started to get extremely concerned, not just because of the ecological crisis, but because of human nature. It seemed we were wired in a way that would result in the worst possible case scenario. 10 or 15 years ago, people had already speculated that this could lead to the extinction of the human species. Even if things didn't go that far, it was still terrifying. I then pursued the topic with a great deal more urgency after that conversation, almost in a state of panic, and I went on to devote thousands and thousands of hours to advocacy and further study and research on my part. And I'm not exaggerating. I literally worked on it for years for free as a volunteer. One of the other things that I realized in the course of doing that was that a lot of people, even if they were open-minded and not averse to evidence, simply didn't want to hear about it. Even if they acknowledged that it was true, they found it too difficult to think about, or too depressing, or that they were powerless, or whatever. I'm one of those people who, the harder the challenge gets, the more determined I become to conquer it. When I meet resistance, it just causes me to dig in my heels even harder. The point of all this is that even though this is absolutely true, and even though it represents the biggest challenge that our species or our civilization has ever faced by far, and even though this situation is dire and urgent, and it represents a clear and present danger to civilization, there is a tremendous amount of resistance to it. Not to mention all of the financial and corporate interests in maintaining the status quo. The fossil fuel industry has assets in the trillions of dollars, which is more than the GDP of most countries on the planet. But this same phenomenon also applies to many other areas of our reality. There is an incredible amount of inertia and resistance to truth of all forms. Often, this is related to fear. It's like how a lot of people avoid doing their shadow work, even though it's critically important, because it is challenging or upsetting or makes them feel uncomfortable. Even if it sucks, many people prefer the status quo over the unknown or having to confront uncomfortable truths, or, in the case of spirituality, do their shadow work. It's one of the most bizarre things about human beings. This is why, I believe, it takes eons for us to evolve. With humanity as a whole, it seems we have to go right to the edge of the cliff before we make major changes. The situation has to be really dire and in our faces. There's all kinds of people out there who just deny science. For some reason, they think that even if they have no credentials whatsoever, that they're smarter or more informed than the world's scientists, scientific bodies, scientific institutions, higher education institutions, and so on. That's a big mystery to me, that people who are completely unqualified believe they know more than tens of thousands of scientists. This subject has been studied more than any other subject in all of human history because of the gravity of the implications of it. So yeah, how someone sitting in their basement with no training or education can question that reasonably is a bit mind-boggling, but there's tons of people out there like that. They don't understand the difference between belief, as in religious belief, and science. I don't get it. It makes no sense to me. Personally, if someone devotes a lifetime to studying some particular topic, I'm totally willing to acknowledge that and respect it. Not all experts are right all the time. In the case of science, at least, it has self-correcting mechanisms that will eventually play out. Some people are just contrarian or conspiratorial by nature. It's like they feel like they can't do anything about reality, so everybody must be against them. It's a kind of paranoia. And there's not much you can do about those people because whatever everybody else thinks, they'll just think the opposite. They're in a fear-based state of being. And of course, there's always vested interests who promote conspiracy theories because it distracts and deflects from the real issues that people should be focused on. So contrarians and conspiracists are the easiest people to manipulate. There's also a very strong strain of this kind of thing, especially in the United States, I find, where you have people who, like I said, have no education or training in particular areas, yet feel that their opinions are just as valid as the experts. They don't respect expertise. This is actually a huge problem in academia these days, where professors are dealing with hordes of people who believe that after watching something on YouTube for 5 minutes, that they know as much as somebody who studied it for 30 years. Like, it's just absurd. It's a weird form of hubris. And of course, people can't differentiate between low-quality information and high-quality information. They have no powers or ability to discriminate or discern what's a valid source and what isn't. That some random person can put something on a blog who has no credentials. Oh, I'm a researcher. What the hell? That means nothing, right? This is why science has a peer review process to separate the wheat from the chaff. Sometimes things slip through the cracks, but it gets corrected. It's self-correcting. Nobody is perfect. Personally, if I make a claim, I can back it up with a credible source. I'm constantly checking my facts. That's why it takes me so long to produce my content, because I have to verify, double-check, triple-check sometimes, because I don't want to make a mistake and embarrass myself. In my work in the past, I have communicated with some of the top people on the planet in terms of being experts on the topic of the environmental crisis. These people are incredibly intelligent and incredibly well informed. I'm more of a big picture person. I'm not a hyper-detailed person. I have seen earth scientists argue about minutia for days, if not weeks. Like, they don't just accept anything at face value. And they will nitpick you to death. Like I said, it's self-correcting. Whereas people who are not trained will make all kinds of claims and statements with no shred of evidence, no citations, and walk around and believe what they think is true with no legitimate foundation whatsoever. And of course, if you confront them, they'll get angry and upset because their egos get bruised, and they don't like that. So they will just disappear. It's very infantile and childlike. Aside from denial or indifference, there's another approach I've seen people adopt, which is nihilism. This is basically throwing up your arms and saying, we're screwed, there's nothing we can do about it, it's over. Accepting defeat, in other words. Obviously, if significant numbers of people adopt that approach, we really are screwed. So that is not a viable option, or one that I would ever personally endorse. You could argue that nihilism is perhaps even more dangerous than denial. Why? Because the nihilist accepts that what's happening is happening, but chooses to do nothing about it, other than promoting fear and cynical resignation, which is the worst case scenario. Very dangerous and irresponsible. The world is full of armchair quarterbacks. It's one of the most frustrating things about recent times. I see so much bullshit, you wouldn't believe it. I often, for example, check the comments section at CBC News, the Canadian national broadcaster, just to see what people are saying about particular things. And the amount of absolute garbage and flat-out lies in the comments section is astonishing and alarming. Clearly, these people have an agenda, and often it seems like they're astroturfing for the fossil fuel industry, and it appears coordinated. But of course, they won't come out and say it because they're cowards. And I have written the CBC at different levels, all the way down to particular shows, and said, you need to turn off the comments section. You're doing a disservice to humanity. It's irresponsible because people are using the comment section to promote propaganda and lies, and they're doing it deliberately. I've written them many times over many years, and they've never once responded. Probably because the comments section generates a lot of page views for their articles and their website, and so they would rather promote dangerous nonsense than be responsible. It's infuriating and grossly negligent. The province of Alberta, Canada's oil and gas province, went so far as to launch a $30 million war room to counter criticism of the oil and gas industry and its perceived climate activist enemies. We're not exactly sure what they do, but perhaps we're seeing their handiwork in certain article comment sections. And of course, many people will reject knowledge or information that undermines their financial status or welfare. Like, for example, if they work in some industry, they will just block out or deny information that contradicts that because they're conflicted and have vested interests. There are certain organizations that I personally would never be affiliated with in any way whatsoever because of their profoundly unethical and immoral history. And yet, millions of people continue to do that, despite all of the evidence about how atrocious and irresponsible and harmful some of these organizations have been throughout history. How they reconcile that dilemma is completely beyond me. There are certain institutions and organizations that should have been buried years ago. But millions of people will overlook all of that evidence and all of those contradictions somehow, for some reason, as if they don't exist. That is denial. And it's also irresponsible. Yet, that is exactly what happens. It's one of the greatest flaws or failures of human character. Our ability to reject information that contradicts our beliefs, affiliations, and interests, aka motivated reasoning. It's a form of narcissism. As the saying goes, people are entitled to their own opinions, but not their own facts. Another thought I have often had is that maybe many older people feel a deep, unexpressed sense of guilt or remorse about the state of the planet they are leaving behind, and that denying that the problem exists is one way of coping and dealing with the guilt. Now, that's not true for all old people, but it certainly could be for many, and they might not be willing to admit it for obvious reasons. Being a Cassandra or being a truth teller is a very difficult path. I'm getting chills saying that. And that is why there are not many of them. It is one of the most difficult paths you can choose. I'm getting really strong chills right now. Because it often means that you have to do this alone and on the basis of your own convictions, disregarding all of the negative feedbacks you get from other people and from society. Truth tellers will often literally be ostracized, even by their own community, because people don't want to hear the truth. So if you're a truth teller, pat yourself on the back. And I mean doing it with integrity. If you encounter evidence that requires you to correct your thinking, you have to be willing to accept and embrace it. You can't be in denial. You have to be rigorous. You have to check your sources. You have to be able to differentiate between bullshit and truth. You have to be ruthlessly committed to the truth and set your ego aside. Even if you've been saying something for years, if it later on turns out to be false, you have to acknowledge that and admit it. Now, that hasn't happened in the case of the environmental crisis because the worst case scenarios are proving to be true. And this has been consistent for decades. So this is the problem that humanity faces. Most of humanity wants to live in a fantasy. They don't actually want to look at or believe reality, even if it's staring them in the face. And the same thing is true in the spiritual community. People will latch on to beliefs without actually validating them, and they will make all kinds of assumptions that send them further and further off into deluded thinking. We have to be ruthless. This is why so few people get to really advanced levels, because it's hard. So that's what I wanted to share, that there is a phenomenal amount of resistance within humanity to the truth. It's almost easier to be complacent and fall into the dark side because it rewards the ego than it is to be vigilant about the truth. And that, like I said, is why there are so few people willing to do that. And it also explains why so many people focus on superficial things, because they're not threatening and they're easy. It's easy to talk about, I don't know, celebrities or whatever, because it makes no difference whether you're right or you're wrong. But when we're dealing with the survival of humanity or the survival of civilization, the stakes could not be higher. In the spiritual community, I have, on many occasions, heard people express things that were supposedly coming from their guides that are unethical and immoral. Like, for example, highly personal details about someone's anatomy. Would highly advanced spiritual guides disclose such personal, salacious details about anybody regardless of who they are? Of course not. If so, those guides are on the same level as your average human being, meaning they're not very spiritually advanced. But a lot of people will just listen to this kind of stuff and not even think about it, as if it's normal to be invading someone's privacy and exposing salacious and completely irrelevant information about them without their permission or consent, breaching their free will and harming them for no possible benefit or reasonable justification, and never think twice about it. Many people are just intellectually lazy, and they don't like other people pointing that out, even though it's true. That is the world we're dealing with. Meanwhile, humanity is staring down the barrel of a dystopic, apocalyptic future, and people are focused on trivial, irrelevant, meaningless frivolities. I published my 9th intention today, titled The Nature Realms. Perhaps it's fitting to end with that here, but you can access it separately on my YouTube channel or on my website at aquariandiary.com. It goes like this. Let it be known that I honor, appreciate, respect, and love the natural realms and the natural kingdoms of Earth. I ask Spirit and the Creator to protect and give fortitude to those natural realms and all of the beings that constitute them. Let those beings know that I stand with them, that I offer my support and cooperation, that I express sincere gratitude for all of the nourishment, comfort, and shelter they have provided, that I acknowledge and honor their importance and right to exist, and that I will do my part to protect them. So be it. Amen. End of Intention 9. I'll put links in the episode description to any related content, and if you're interested in a reading with me, I'll put a link to that as well. The June 2023 mini readings that I do will focus on the transit of the North Node through Aries, which is coming up starting in July. It's now going to cost $39, and people who are paying members of my YouTube channel will have the price of their monthly membership discounted from that price. Take care, all the best, and I'll talk to you again soon. Bye for now.